But speaking of tough old birds, we get back to Pfefer, and you talked about New York a few minutes ago. And folks, we could be here, Brian and I, for hours and hours trying to explain what we referred to a few minutes ago, how that Vince McMahon Sr. was not the original wrestling promoter in Madison Square Garden, or not even during, most of the time, the first 10, 15 years of its modern heyday when it became sellout business. The book that is indispensable if you're a fan of the WWF, WWWF, WWF, whatever the fuck, New York wrestling, from the history of it, the cards, the gates, the backstage information, who was promoting. Scott Teal at Crowbar Press did Wrestling at the Garden with the historian J. Michael Kenyon, who's since passed away, but it has at crowbarpress.com pretty much all the information for wrestling in Madison Square Garden through 2016, from the late 1800s. And you get the story because it was so complicated. But the Pfefer files have reinstigated in me just how fascinating it was that even in the modern era, New York, as the city, the Garden, was the last major city to still have people jockeying for power and control and in and out. And it was all because of the way the Garden was set up. And Brian, you probably remember there was in the 30s, 40s, 50s, it wasn't like today where the WWE could just go and rent Madison Square Garden and bring their show in and promote it. Or even that UFC could do the same thing, or Don King or Bob Arum could have brought boxing in and just done their own thing. The Garden had dedicated in-house boxing and wrestling promoters named the Johnstons. It was a family, I think brothers, a brother-in-law, potentially an uncle, whatever. But the Johnstons were able to control, because they had the contract for boxing and wrestling at Madison Square Garden, what talent was brought in, what promoters that they got talent from, who had input. And they had, from the late 40s revival, which we'll talk about in a second, they had a staff of wrestling advisors. And one of them was Cola Queriani, the old wrestler and strongman, because he had a piece of Antonino Rocca. And Rocca became the Golden Goose. So he would advise the Johnstons and some of the, other old timers that were around. I think Milo Steinbort may have still been involved. And then the Toots Mondt started the Manhattan Booking Agency, and Pedro Martinez in the 50s bought in and then felt like he got screwed and sold and got back out, went to Buffalo. And all that, Jack Pfefer was in the middle of this. As was he on the in as an advisor and a talent agent? Or was he on the outs? When Vince Sr. first got control, it eliminated Pfefer. But because Vince Sr. couldn't, his Capital Wrestling from Washington couldn't just take over the Garden, they still had to work through the Johnstons. They fell out. Pfefer got another little run. But then Vince Sr. and Toots got together. It was goddamn Game of Thrones with, gangsters and floppy fucking men's hats, right? So the point being, we go back to when, Brian, I'll bring you in on this for a second. I've droned on long enough. But we've talked about there was no wrestling in Madison Square Garden from the mid-third 1937 until 1949, 12 years. Because the business had been drooping, and the exposés, the bad press, and the double crosses, and all the shit that had been done to hurt the business. They didn't have wrestling in the Garden, but they did have it in all of what they called the small clubs around the city, the smaller arenas, the suburban places, the old, the marigold gardens of, like Chicago. They had in New York, the Jamaica Arena. Brian, that's in Queens, right?
That's right, yeah.
They had a Ridgewood Grove. They had a Queensboro Arena, a St. Nicholas Arena. and Eastern Parkway Arena in Queens. I would assume probably all those buildings are gone from those days. Would you think by now? Do you ever see anything of that?
Oh, certainly. I mean, the most famous case, I guess, is Sunnyside Garden became a Wendy's. And then the rumor for years was that it was Bobby Davis's Wendy's, and it turns out that wasn't true. But that's at least the location that's still there.
Yeah, his were in Columbus, Ohio. But the point is, there was still wrestling, and there was still a New York circuit. And we'll go back in time with some more papers I haven't even had time to copy yet, but there's documents on the buildings around the New York area that were being run in 1940 and how they were paying guys on those. It's fascinating. But nevertheless, they had been still running these small clubs, and there was still different booking agencies trying to get power and pull and get their wrestlers over. In 1949, they decided to try it again in the Garden with Gorgeous George off television. And George bombed. They drew 4,100 people, and the gate was $13,000. And so they didn't try again until December. That was 10 months later. But by then, they had brought Rocca in, and Rocca was a hit. And I know people are saying, well, how did he get over if they didn't run shows? They not only ran the live shows around New York City, but Brian, would you like some TV information on what the wrestling fans could watch on television in New York City from 1947 to 1950? There were 7 TV stations on the air in New York City by 1950. 7 of them. That's twice as many as probably anywhere but Los Angeles, I would think.
Can I take a guess? And again, this is early on, but Channel 2, which would then become WCBS down the road. Channel 4, WNBC, which probably wasn't WNBC yet.
It was WNBT.
Channel 5, which had several different call letters. I don't think it would be RKO.
WABD.
That would become Fox 5 many, many years later. Channel 7, which would become ABC, but definitely wasn't in 47. Channel 9, WOR.
WOR.
Channel 11, PIX, but it probably wasn't PIX then.
WPIX still was.
And I don't know what, I mean, there wasn't PBS on 13 then. I think that's it.
No, WATV 13.
Huh. I don't know about that one.
So a point is, almost nobody had televisions, but they had been showing regular wrestling programs locally since at least 1947. There were 7 TV stations in New York City in 1950. All 7 of them had a wrestling show on the air weekly. They were, Dennis James had the Jamaica Arena in Queens on Channel 5 from Fridays from 8:30 until sign off. So just the rest of the night, however long they were on the air, was the fucking wrestling.
Wow.
And then that switched to WOR9. On Thursday nights, they had shows on some station from Columbia Park in North Bergen, New Jersey. In the wintertime, WPIX would have shows from Ridgewood Grove. In the summer, they'd do the Queensboro Arena. Tuesday nights, St. Nicholas Arena on Channel 4, Eastern Parkway Arena, Queens on WPIX. WJZ7, that's what that was, aired the TV from Washington, and both of the Chicago TVs from the Rainbow Arena and the Marigold Arena aired. The Marigold was on the Dumont Network. And on Saturdays, they had a Broadway arena in Brooklyn, apparently, that had matches on WOR. And they also, at some point, had matches from Sunnyside Gardens. They had a series of shows from Jersey on Channel 13, etc.
Connecticut, too. Bridgeport.
There you go. So it dominated the airwaves. And when they brought Rocca in and got him on television, they go to the Garden in December and they do 17,854 people, which was a sellout at that point in time, $50,639 at the gate. That's $650,000 in today's money for a house show. And all of a sudden, they had a hit where the Garden was doing turnaway business, but they were still running the small clubs. So this is a sample of information that I got.
And Jersey. You know, Willie Gilzenberg, we had talked about him previously, he was running a bunch of towns in Jersey all throughout these years.
Yes. And at the same time, and Willie Gilzenberg is all over the Pfefer files. He was writing him. They were close personal friends. And he would talk about his, oh my God, what was the main town here? Newark. Newark was his town, which is right across the river.
That's where his office was, yeah.
But the point is, in December, they drew almost 18,000 people and 50 grand at the Garden. They were all over the newspapers. Wrestling is back in the Garden. But then the first week in January, this is a sample of the kind of regular business they were doing after the big Garden card, just what they were doing every week. The St. Nicholas Arena, where is that? Was that Long Island?
I thought it was Queens, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm actually not sure.
I don't, hold on. What does it say up here? I don't know, but I thought I'll defer to your geography. How far is that from the Garden?
Again, I don't know. St. Nicholas Arena was 69 West 66th Street and Columbus Avenue. So that was actually in Manhattan. That wasn't too far from the Garden. And that was not the Garden where it is now. That was the Garden on 8th Avenue.
Okay, well, apparently these were weekly towns that they were running, but on the first week of January, they ran the St. Nicholas Arena and did $5,000 with Rocca on top. And that might not sound like a lot, except the ticket prices at the same time in the Garden in the mid 50s, when they were selling out and turning them away, was a $5 front row ringside. So at the St. Nicholas Arena down the street or whatever, tickets were like 3-1, if that. The point is, they're drawing a couple of thousand people at St. Nicholas Arena to see Rocca.
And by the way,
65 grand in today's money. Go ahead.
The St. Nicholas Arena would become the location of ABC's television studios in New York City.
Well, there you go. And what about Hempstead?
That's on
this
Long
is
Island.
the way it was written.
Hempstead or West
Long
Hempstead?
No, it just says Hempstead.
Okay.
If Hempstead's on Long Island, that's up in the region, right? The same week, possibly the following night. This is the first week in January. They did $3,500 with Rocca in the main event. And again, that's probably at the ticket price at the time, 1,500 to 2,000 people. Then they go to Jamaica. That's in Queens, right?
That is in Queens, yes.
Without Rocca, they still do $1,500. Then the Bronx Winter Garden, right? That's a thing. Bronx Winter Garden. They did $1,100. And then Asbury Park, New Jersey, they did $700. Poor Asbury Park, but in January. Point being, they did $11,800 at the gate for 5 events in the metropolitan area and poor old Asbury Park, which is the equal of 150 grand in today's money. And that was one of their weeks. So if they could do the equivalent of $600,000 in today's money every month in these weekly shows around town, and they were doing the equivalent of $500,000 plus at the Garden once a month, this is $10 or $12 million in today's money out of the New York metropolitan area. And how many thousands and thousands of tickets are we talking about?
Yeah. And again, the spot shows that were attached to that territory go up into Connecticut. At this point in time, they go into New Jersey. It's a lot of towns, Long Island. With Rocca, I don't know what you saw there. I don't know what Pfefer had. But I'm curious about the coverage. I've actually never gone back and checked out the coverage he was getting in the New York papers before he arrived. I've seen some of the coverage in the papers, and I have the programs for Texas when he first arrived, and he was a sensation there. But that's the other thing I'd like to see, is just how was he presented in the New York papers.
That's the papers scoffed at it. The papers, when the second time that when they bombed with Gorgeous George, right? Because the papers had kind of scoffed because wrestling's going back to the Garden. And then they were kind of like, I told you so, right? It bombed. And then it wasn't until after that they sold out, turned people away, and created chaos that the paper's like, shit, this Rocca guy. And then it was like they still hooted at wrestling, but they had to acknowledge or somehow recognize that all of a sudden this wrestling stuff, the old grunt and groan stuff, is the hottest ticket in town. And the cops on horseback are turning thousands of people away from Madison Square Garden. They had to acknowledge it, while they, at the same time, a lot of them were like, can you imagine? They're, this bullshit is causing this chaos, but they had to acknowledge.
So what year are we talking
beforehand,
right now?
it was all the television.
What year are we talking right now?
Rocca started, he was introduced later in 49.
In 49.
In New York.
The riot is in 57. We did a guest the program where there was a separate riot at a Policemen's Benevolent Association show in New Jersey a month later. That's how hot he was almost a decade after arriving.
Yeah, and now, to be fair, he cooled off. They went a period, I think it was from 55 to 56, where they stopped running shows in the Garden again for a year because the crowd was starting to dwindle. And again, they could just do that. The Johnstons could do that because, it wasn't like, oh my God, this is my main town in my territory. It was more primitive than that at that point. But then they opened it up again. And this is where, again, the Pfefer groups and the Vince Sr. groups and all the other groups kept trying to get in and get a hold. But when they opened up again, not only was it fresh, but that's when they hit on Rocca and Perez. Because now Rocca had drawn all those huge houses in the single matches, but he was so limited, people had seen the routine. They freshened it up. Now he has this young protege that the heels are going to beat the shit out of, and he's going to then get the tag, and then he's going to beat everybody up. And Rocca got another 5 years out of that. And at the same time, that's when Pfefer, I didn't look at the Rocca file, but there's a lot of people writing him about Zuma, because for that brief period of time, he got Zuma over as the second coming of Rocca, to the point where they had to work with each other when Pfefer was in control. Because it sold out. I can't imagine how hideous it must have been. Sold out twice, didn't it? Yeah. But after Pfefer was gone, you didn't see Zuma no more. So that was Pfefer was the master at stealing a house, but people would smarten up, and that's why he needed to move the freaks and the knockoffs and the gimmicks around a lot. But nevertheless, the point is that at that point in New York City, I know everybody's saying, oh, wrestling's more popular than ever, even if it was more popular in the 80s or whatever, the Attitude Era or whatever. But if you were in New York City in January 1950, you could watch wrestling multiple hours on every TV station that existed every day of the week, and go to shows in the Metro New York City area, whatever they call the Big Apple and its environs, 4 or 5 nights a week. And they were turning them away from Madison Square Garden, and it was making the newspapers. How could something be more mainstream in the biggest city in the country than that?
Also, it makes you wonder what kind of different business it potentially could have done if they brought Gorgeous George in 50 instead of when they did bring him in. Just based on how much TV there was in 50 versus 47, let's say.
Well, no, because he didn't come in. See, that's the thing. They'd still been seeing him for a while because of the network broadcasts and because of the tapes going in. But they were at the point where they needed the ethnic superstar because they'd been trashed so long in the mainstream press in New York. That's why once that Rocca got over like that, they wouldn't get off of it. Bob Backlund was the next All-American boy 30 years later to be the champion, because that's where they found the niche, and that's where they were turning them away, and that's where they did the same thing with Bruno, except gradually the appeal went to everybody, but they felt like they had to have the ethnic hero.
Pedro Morales too.
Yeah. And everybody else was just, a transitional cog in the wheel to get there.
That's the most interesting life story that could probably never be fully put into a book. Antonino Rocca. Because the more you find out about him from sources outside of wrestling who wrote books, he may have been involved with like the CIA. I'm serious. Like he was.
No, I know that.
There were years where he disappeared, where he may have been like just helping the government in like South America. Like there's all sorts of weird stuff around Rocca, who did just disappear at a certain point.
And that's the thing, is you have to. I know he was almost like the wrestling version of the old Primo Carnera. They cut up his money till there was almost nothing left. A lot of people had a piece of him, especially during that run. But the money that he generated has to be, I think, in 1950. Let me hit. I won't make you guess all these, but guess what the average family income was in the United States in 1950 per year?
1950? I'm going to get this wrong. $7,000.
$3,300 was the average family income in 1950. So when Rocca goes to, what was it? St. Nicholas Arena and draws $5,000, that's more than most people make in a year. And out of 40 million families in the United States, 1.3 million made over $10,000. 1/40th. The average price of a new home was $7,150. The top Ford car was $2,300. Minimum wage, if you qualified for it, a lot of jobs didn't at that point, more didn't than did, 75 cents an hour. And steak was 77 cents a pound. So when Rocca...
Wrestling programs, 10 cents.
Yeah. With Rocca, and I've got documentation. Jackie Fargo made $1,000 for one of his Madison Square Garden appearances in 1960 against Rocca and Perez. That's the equivalent of $11,000 in today's money. Well, 10 years earlier, Rocca is the guy that suddenly all these fucking crowds are being drawn by, and he's the golden goose of the promoters, and the horsemen or the cops on horses are beating people away from Madison Square Garden, and they've all got a piece of him. So, of course, he was making, if he sold out the Garden, he probably made the same thing in one night before deductions that the average family made in a year. And somehow, even though they say the guys are making millions of dollars these days, the pay scale has not kept up. It doesn't seem like with the other escalating expenses.
I saw somewhere on social media someone jumped on me for they make millions of dollars. You don't know what you're talking about, Brian. Compared to other athletes, they don't make the same amount of money. It's not even close.
Compared to athletes in their profession many, many years ago, they do not make the same percentage of money, you might say also, or adjusted in however, is what we're trying to say. Is that, and I'll leave you with one more thing, and then we'll move on to the unreal world of the WWE.